Welcome back. We're going to continue our consideration of the book of Ecclesiastes today. And we're spending the first number of weeks introducing the book, thinking about themes, and then we've systematically walked through, or at least more or less, the first 3 chapters of the book. One thing that's going to happen different today is that we get into a whole section, this middle narrative, this collection of sayings, this back and forth and back and forth. And these chapters, really from chapter 4 up through 11 in many ways, do not follow as clear of a pattern. So just a warning to you, we're going to have to go a little bit more topical, a little bit more thematic for today's consideration as we look at the book. Before we get there, mention, as we've been having a habit of doing, a little personal artifact in the office. It's a suggestion. If you got to find yourself, someone told me one time when I was 18, 19, they're like, one day when you have an office, it's good. Keep something fun, keep something playful, keep something from home, keep something joyful in there. And so I've tried to follow that throughout, and I've been showing you a couple things because we can't be in person. Soon, hopefully soon, there will be a lessening to this pandemic, but for now we're way apart, so a couple personal things. This one's really meaningful. You waiting for it? You ready for it? University of North Dakota National Championship banner from 2016. This is a national championship in something that you may have never, it's funny, I live in Florida now. Many people have never even watched hockey live, let alone played it. This is ice hockey. And many people don't realize this. So I grew up outside of the town of Grand Forks. That's where the University of North Dakota is. And the University of North Dakota is renowned for hockey. It's a small school. In fact, for many years when I was growing up, it was Division II and not even FCS or whatever it is. They are now. But they were Division II in everything because it's such a small school except for Division I hockey. More NHL players have come through the University of North Dakota college program than any other in the nation. We have won 8 national championships. Players that you've probably heard of and gone on to success and won Stanley Cups in the NHL. Ed Belfour, Zach Parise, Jonathan Taves, TJ Oshie, who was like an Olympic hero over the last couple of years, Brock Nelson, Brock Besser. There's like all these players now in the NHL who create this little, group of alumni. And this one's really special and unique to me because this was won in Tampa. And I got to go down for part of the Frozen Four. My best friend, who has since passed, he and his wife were also able to come over, and they were in town for this particular thing. We got tickets, we got to go and celebrate it. But if you didn't know, now you know. University of North Dakota has a $120 million leathered out, amazing stadium, one of the best sports facilities in the world for hockey, and we dominate, and we're the best. So I keep this in the office just to wave around. And it really doesn't get much use. No one's offended by it. It's not like can you imagine if I put like a UF thing up there or something? But if you have a college hockey team, you might be offended if you come in and it's not us, but I doubt it. So I keep that. All right, we ready? We ready to dive into Ecclesiastes? A couple of things just to wrap up from where we've come from. So the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is what we talked about last. It's where we were over the last number of minutes in the last video. If you haven't caught up with videos, I'd encourage you. They should be somewhere up in the left for you to peek at on the website if you're there, if you're finding it on Vimeo. If you're on YouTube, I'm sure it's in the playlist somewhere. There's an interesting turning point in Ecclesiastes in chapter 3. And what is happening, I believe, in verse 11 of chapter 3, and the idea that God put eternity in the hearts of men. He put eternity into the hearts of men. That concept starts to give shape to why the book vacillates between what seems to be such a despairing, hopeless. In other words, how could someone who's writing in the Bible and then tells us clearly sometimes, enjoy the good gifts of God and fear him, how can that person seem so foolish and hopeless in other circumstances? And this is partly because the whole design of the book is to reveal the utter foolishness of this world. If you hope only here and now, in this material place, in the days that we've been given, if you seek to find ultimate meaning in just the things that you can see with your eyes or touch with your hands, their 5 senses is your only outlet, your only means of discovering ultimate meaning, you're just going to be a fool. That's the argument of the whole book, and it's written from start to finish In many ways, start to finish, it's written as a complete diatribe, a full argument to unveil, to unmask all of the attempts at meaning under the sun, save the meaning that God can give. And not only is ultimate meaning difficult, impossible, a fruitless search here on the earth, but there's a sense of sadness about it. And the reason there's a sense of sadness in humans about it, what he says in Ecclesiastes 3, is because we've been given, eternity is in our hearts. We've been made in the image of God that's irrevocable. Doesn't matter how atheistic you are, how materialistic you are, you cannot escape a sense of longing. So Ecclesiastes is about longings. It's about all the longings that humans have for material goods and pleasure. We saw that last chapter. He did not, or the last couple chapters, he did not deny himself any pleasure. All the longings we have for those things are also connected with a longing that we have for meaning that is just too big. Nothing in the world can fill it, but we still have it and we can't shut it off. And at the end of chapter 3, it's interesting. He compares mankind to beasts. I mentioned it at the end of last video, but I wanted to come back to it. He compares mankind to beasts. And what is unique about this, especially in our day and age, is the ongoing connection between two things that seem illogical. They seem like they're in opposites together. It's these two facts. Modern philosophy, modern humanism, the materialistic viewpoint of the world will tell us that we should not imagine humans as somehow being special, that we are simply a more developed, bigger-brained animal. That's all we are. We're just like the beasts. We should have no claim over anything. And they have just as much right. There's no sense of a kind of specialness, a uniqueness, a dignity in human life that's different than anything else in creation. And so Ecclesiastes, at the end of chapter 3, talks about, well, who can know? Don't beasts die and humans die and that kind of thing? And the materialistic worldview that we live in will tell us, yes, humans are just animals that have figured out how to, make artwork. However, at the same time, and this happens not only in Ecclesiastes, but currently in our world, you can see it. The fact that you believe you're just an advanced animal doesn't change the fact that God gave you eternity. He placed eternity, his image, in your heart, and you're going to have to wrestle with that your whole life. And so a wonderful quote from this book that I thought I'd just mention now. This book is called Joy at the End of the Tether. Joy at the End of the Tether. It's a reflection on Ecclesiastes by Douglas Wilson. And he's got some great quotes in here. If you know Wilson, he's a little edgy in a lot of ways. And so hopefully we can be mature enough to take edgy things and benefit from them and then say like, that's not for me. I don't think I need a disclaimer like that. We're all mature and nuanced and understand that if you only learn from people who always say the perfect thing that agrees with you, we're going to be pretty narrow people. So anyway, I benefit a ton from books like this. And there's a wonderful quote in here where Wilson comments at the end of chapter 3. And he says, the funny thing about human beings, especially in our day and age, is that they'll tell you that you're no different than animals. And then with the same amount of passion, picket and yell at you and scream and get violent, saying that we should save the whales. And then here's the line. He says that we should save the whales as though we were in charge of them or something. As though we were in charge. Now, and here's the thing. We are. We are. That is why the human effort to both deconstruct our meaning away from God to an atheistic worldview also holds a million contradictions about humans' unique purpose for good. And people borrow the moralism, they borrow the meaning, they borrow the passion that we ought to have to extend beyond this life and say we need to get out there, we need to save everything. But that makes no sense. If we're just a part of this cosmic chaos that really has no meaning, then why should we feel bad as though we were in charge of them or something? And it's that thing that's going on all the way through Ecclesiastes. It's highlighted at the end of chapter 3, and really from verse 11 on, that humans cannot rest the way that beast rests. Humans have to pursue meaning because we've been designed to do so. And despite every philosopher's effort to tell us that we are just a speck, a tiny little dot. Maybe you've heard the phrasing from Carl Sagan on his photo, the pale blue dot. Just abandon meaning. We're just dust. We're just space dust. But the funny thing is that space dust feels deeply and longs spiritually and wants something beyond this life. And that is telling. That is an invitation. If anything else, the foolishness that's described in Ecclesiastes, how it just unmasks all of these attempts for meaning in a worldly sense, becomes an invitation to say, why am I like this? Why do I long for something? And that drives you into the hope of the rest of the Bible. All right, so back to something that I mentioned earlier. I said that there was a sense to the first 3 chapters that sort of flow logically. And then what happened at the beginning of chapter 4 up through 11 is that it starts to feel more like Proverbs. If you've ever read Proverbs in Scripture, you'll know that it's impossible really to teach it verse by verse, chapter by chapter. It seems as though the meaning shifts everywhere. It goes right to left and up and down and over. There'll be a section that's powerful and wonderful on adultery or on money, and then it just skips and goes away. And then 4 chapters later, you'll have an additional just soaring passage on these things. And you might read it, and if you're an organized person, you think to yourself, just take this from this chapter and put it back over here. That's not the way that it works. Now, I'm not a linguistic scholar. I don't know these things super well, but I think what a lot of people would say is this is us bumping into the barriers of our understanding of Hebrew language, Hebrew syntax, Hebrew thinking, really, the way that they think. My friend Alex pointed out, I believe it was a guy named Robert Kaplan, wrote an essay in the 60s that described, as we search through literature, the way that we can see there's a pattern to it that's different depending on the tradition and the way of thinking of that people, and even the way the language works changes it. So in English, we just think, be logical, get us from A to B, and you can be artful along the way, but just build. That's why so many Americans, they don't like poetic things oftentimes. Whereas it seems like what's going to happen in the middle of Ecclesiastes is much like Proverbs, where the thinking goes more like this. Like we're making some progress, like we're starting, say up here, we start here, we're making some progress, and we start to go here, but then we zigzag. And then there's some hesitations, and then some backs, and then it's hesitations, and then we zigzag. And it's a building argument, but it's not all neat in one place. So the reason I'm making such a big deal about this is that I'm really going to go topical here for a little while. I'm just going to bring up some groupings of thoughts that Ecclesiastes has to say for us. Some areas where it tells us, or it shows us, meaning cannot be found here. So stop trying. First one, and this is absolutely a key to the endless pursuit of meaning and the sadness that people feel for it. And what he brings up at the beginning of chapter 4 is what I'm just going to call the topic of injustice and suffering. So if you're trying to find ultimate meaning in the world, just look around for a while, and what Ecclesiastes is going to tell us, what Koheleth is going to insist on, is that no matter how hopeful you are for this world and this life under the sun, just look at suffering for a little while, and you'll be discouraged and realize the vanity. So I'm going to read first 3 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 4. He says, "Again, I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold, the tears of the oppressed. They had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead, who are already dead, more fortunate than the living." So have you ever felt suffering that deep, or you felt it for someone else that deep? "They're more fortunate than the living, who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not been born, has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun." Now, this is some heavy writing. Surprising to find it in Scripture. But it's the sort of honesty, it's the kind of grappling that one must do. In fact, Christians through the ages, we never get fully removed from the difficulty that suffering in this life is. We believe and we know that God has a purpose for these things, that he's good, and we entrust ourselves to him. But it doesn't help the sense, it doesn't help the feeling sometimes of the just complete suffering that we see around us in so many ways, and much of it so meaningless. And so what happens in this injustice and suffering passage is that Solomon, who is in a position of power, is looking out and he's observing. And he's simply saying, let me tell you what happens in this world. People suffer and they're oppressed, and there's no hope for them. Now that's amazing. But he essentially says this: no matter what inventions of humanity come, there is something about the way the world works that there will always be oppressed and there will always be oppressors. Power will always be abused. That's his experience. Wisdom shows him that power will be abused. Now, anyone who has lived in this world, in fact, I would say that this concept, are human beings bent endlessly toward abuse of power and self-serving, Or are humans generally and innately good, where eventually, given enough time, we're going to undo suffering? The second option there, this idea that humans are innately good and all we need is enough technology and enough thinking and enough progress or enough political, X, Y, Z, that we'll just undo suffering on our own. Solomon says, good luck with that. Just good luck with that. It is a fool who thinks that way. It is wisdom to say that there is something about the human experience, there's something about oppression, about injustice, about power that needs to be checked. I mean, it was this thinking that founded our nation in many ways. Washington did not take the opportunity to become his high, honorable king of the United States. He did not take the potential. There was a moment there where he could have grasped it, but he warned against and said, we need to be careful because power can be abused. And so the founding of our country, in many ways, the genius of America is a political system that is constantly checking power. And when people wring their hands or they stay up at night and they freak out and they protest and down through the ages of America, what's happened is many times they say, well, this particular form of government or this person or this place has too much power. And listen for that refrain. Listen for that refrain. And you'll realize that that is coming from an idea to say, wait, we can't let power be unchecked. Here's why. Because power will oppress eventually. Now, I know I'm sounding like all Karl Marxian here or something. The solution, of course, is not, some kind of different political system. Solomon's going to say, it turns out under the sun, there is no solution. You can do what you want, but this is a human condition. There will be the oppressed and there will be oppressors, and the oppressed can't really do anything about it because they have power in their hands. That's what he's saying. Now, this is stark, but it's given to us as wisdom. He also has a little section on suffering and injustice in chapter 5, which is intriguing. I'm going to read verses 8 and 9. He says, if you see in a province the oppression of the poor and the violation of justice and righteousness, do not be amazed at the matter. Now, wow. Do not be amazed at the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher, and yet there are higher ones over them. But this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivate his fields. All right, I want to talk about this for just a second because there's a few things that are amazing. The wise Solomon tells us in chapter 4 that it's power that keeps the oppressed oppressed, and that's going to keep going on. Then he tells us in chapter 5 that if you look out and you see the poor being oppressed, and if there's a violation of justice, if there's injustice and there's unrighteousness, here's the first thing that's interesting. He says, do not be amazed. Wow. Do not be amazed. In other words, he says, it is the foolish, naive person who thinks that injustice is a rare thing in the world. It is a foolish, naive person who does not understand or has not plumbed the depths of depravity, of striving for power and wealth in this world. Now, it sounds cold. It sounds difficult. What do you mean, do not be amazed at the matter? And it may sound cold, but it's real. Furthermore, it's real, and you shouldn't be amazed because it happens all over the globe. And let me be clear about this. This has happened in every society, in nearly every single ethnic group, every race, every period of human history, under any political system. Eventually, you will start to see people using power, using wealth, using the gears of political process to gain and to push down. He says, don't be amazed by this. We can't be that foolish. We have to be wiser than this. Don't be amazed. Then he makes this argument that's interesting in chapter 5. He says, don't be amazed at it, for the high official is watched by a higher, and then there are even yet higher ones over them. Now, he gives a reason for why this oppression continues here that I think needs to be considered. He says, don't be amazed, for a high official has someone higher, and then that person even has someone higher. Now, I'm going to give a hopeful interpretation of this. Maybe what he's saying is, don't be amazed, there's injustice, but eventually God is at the highest level and he's going to see. And that's clearly the message of the rest of the Bible. The way that we deal with injustice, and one of our hopes in the middle of it, is that God ultimately will bring things to a right end. So, yes, you got an official who's in middle management, but he's got a manager, all the way up, and eventually God will judge perfectly. It might be saying that, I don't think it is. I think what he's saying is that one of the reasons this happens is because entire structures of power protect one another. So the lower person is given authority over for oppression and injustice, and then they're really covered by a system that's above them. And then that person is really covered by a system. Now, this is getting into some conspiracy theory kind of stuff, right? Some of you are just getting warmed up. You're getting near to the camera. So the idea here, I'm not saying Illuminati, but certainly wherever ongoing injustice and oppression exists, there are courts of authority. There are levels of higher power that are either turning a blind eye or directly allowing and giving commission for this kind of thing. Again, you want to know a gruesome look at the foolishness of the world, the lack of meaning here, you just read Ecclesiastes through. It's amazing. He says, don't be amazed. They're just going to protect one another through the power. And then he even gives a further motivation for this. And we're going to get to wealth more in a second. But he brings up wealth. This is what he says about, he says, this is gain for a land in every way, a king committed to cultivated fields. A king committed to cultivated fields. Now notice what he just mentioned. There are systems of authority that oppress, exploit, that push down, and it's overlooked because kings are committed to getting a crop. They're committed to having a harvest. They're committing to increase. Again, wow. Systems of power, leverage for wealth, so that the highest can benefit. Again, I'm not making this stuff up. This is scripture. For someone who thinks I'm making political arguments, please put political worldview of everything aside. I don't know. So many of us have been taught to view everything through political lens. This is the Bible. These are arguments from scripture. This is wisdom telling us that we should not be amazed at this, but should be careful and realize this is going to happen. This is going to happen in our world. I think the final thing, though, that comes to us on this topic of injustice and suffering that's difficult is he points out something on both these. Isn't this sad, you might say? It is. He tells us this is inevitable. We should not be amazed. It's just going to continue to progress. In fact, someone might even be offended by Solomon seeming so detached. He's able to just comment on it. And I just want to mention something for the best of us, for the humans who have become heroes, the people who have really sent their whole life in the direction of helping to relieve suffering. I think what we often don't want to admit is that sometimes the people who get closest to suffering and try to relieve it become the most disillusioned at their lack of impact, the inability that they have to completely undo and make things better. Recently, there was a biography that uncovered some letters that Mother Teresa had written. Mother Teresa, of course, an example the world over of someone who moved, gave up any sense of comfort she had to live in Calcutta and deal with suffering. And she was seen as someone who overcame and had such hope. Yet she wrote poignantly in some of the letters that have been covered about her doubts, about her sadness, about the complete discouragement that she saw at the unending suffering in her midst. And I think what Solomon's getting at here, the reason he can be detached, the reason he can sort of pull back, is he says, you know what's another foolish approach to suffering? Being the kind of person who tries to weep every time something bad happens. You will quickly exhaust yourself. And what can happen if you're amazed, if you are appalled, if you try to stir up some kind of emotion thing to it? He says, I've looked around, and though that, that might be noble, it's a good thing. He says, even to relieve suffering ends up being meaningless. It ends up being difficult. It's inevitable. There must be an escape. And what we're going to find. So if you are the person who has wrestled the most and thought about, and please think about it. You know how many people just go their whole life, they just don't even want to think about this kind of stuff? That's not a good thing either. But for the people who have most thought about injustice and suffering and difficulty, they've given their whole life to it. And then here's what ends up happening. We realize, and we get to the point where we say, to really fix this, we need a higher power. To really fix this, we need an escape plan that's different than me just putting Band-Aids on things. And if you get there, then Solomon will say, good, I got you where I want you. If you get to the point where you realize we can't do what we think that we need to do, then you'll be longing for a better cure. And a better cure is what Scripture offers, of course. All right, so one more topic. I did injustice and suffering. I'm just going to hit one more, and we'll wrap up for this particular video. We're going on work and wealth. So work and wealth is a theme all the way through Ecclesiastes. We introduced it in chapter 1. He uses the word toil, which is a wonderful word. Many of us don't use it, but toil has this idea of the exhaustion of work. Not only that, but toil almost seems in the way that it sounds, toil. It's kind of circular. It gives me the idea of digging holes just to fill them, to dig holes just to fill them, to dig holes just to fill them. That's the sort of concept that the Ecclesiastes puts forward for work. And if that's the case, if the concept of work is constantly in here, then we have to say, well, maybe meaning is ultimately from producing. Maybe meaning comes from just getting better work done. And of course, because the whole book is this, he's going to say, no, don't look there. There's no way we can win. Let's go look at chapter 4. We go back a chapter. We're dealing with 4 and 5 really for these topics. But in chapter 4, starting in verse 4, he says, "Then I saw all the toil and all the skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity and a striving after wind." Interesting. Toil and skill comes from a man's envy of his neighbor. It's also vanity and striving after wind. He says in verse 5, "The fool folds his hand and eats his own flesh." You see the juxtaposition here? Verse 4, he says, all the striving, all the skill, someone who's on it, up at 5 a.m., doing push-ups or running the marathons. They build the companies. They become experts. They're just driven. You know what he calls that? He says at the end, they're going to find it was vanity. Then he says, no. The answer here is not to be a fool, because the next verse, he hits those. The fool folds his hands and ends up, he eats his own flesh. What a brilliant image of a lazy person. A lazy person wants to avoid work. Well, they end up having nothing to eat. They just devour themselves. That's what's happening when you're lazy. You're just hurting yourself. I used to tutor math at a school it was like an alternate high school. It was a great job in college. I loved math, and I found this tutoring job. So I'd go into a classroom, and it had a range from 9th graders to 12th graders of kids who had basically been kicked out of regular schools. And I would work with them on math to get them caught up at their own pace so that they could eventually get a GED. And so I did this for a couple of years. It was wonderful to get to know the kids and interact with them a lot. A bunch of cool opportunities to pray for kids and have spiritual conversations too. And talk about that because it wasn't a private thing. But in one of the conversations I had with the kid, I saw this so clearly. There was this kid who became frustrated with his math. He didn't want to do it. And I saw in him the most amazing thing. In order to punish what he saw as this terrible system of work that was forced upon him, he would stop working and be lazy. He would just sit back and shove it, fold his hands. And I remember at one point I just talked to him and I said, here's the weird thing. I get your frustration. Some people don't like math, and I know you have to do work, and my guess is there's a lot going on in your life that doesn't even have to do with this. But let me tell you a little trick here. You're punishing yourself. Like, no one else is being punished. I'm here to help you, and I'm going to be here no matter what. This is my job. You got a teacher there. They're going to be here no matter what. They still go home. Nothing happens with them. These other kids around you, they're working and they're progressing. Whatever's happening in your heart, this laziness that you're dealing with, you're hurting yourself. So I don't know who you're punishing, but you're punishing you. I mean, that's who you think you're punishing, but it's you. That's the argument that he makes here for fools. He says they fold their hands and they end up eating their own flesh. He goes on, better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and a striving after the wind. So now is he commending fools? Because he says better is quietness than 2 handfuls of toil? What is he doing here? He summarizes, again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there's no end to all this toil. His eyes are never satisfied with riches. He never asks, who am I toiling for? Why am I depriving myself of pleasure? What is this all for? And he says, this also is vanity and an unhappy business. This same theme of work and wealth is picked up in verse 10 of chapter 5. He who loves money, he says, will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. What a hilarious thing. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. I see someone getting bigger. You can eat well, so you get big. Essentially, the argument that Solomon is making is that if you place your hope in wealth in this world, or in skill, or in accomplishment, you will not be satisfied. We've seen this the world over. More money doesn't automatically mean more happy. In the same way, laziness brings no satisfaction. You think, if I could just quit work, I'd be happy. And yet, we find in this middle of this pandemic, there's millions, tens of millions of people without work. And all of us know what a difficult thing this is, not only because they're going to have need and lack, but everyone knows that there's something about us that's been made We identify with work. We need to produce, and to lack or to feel like you don't have meaningful work in the world devastates a soul. It eats away. You eat your own flesh if you refuse to work. Now, here's the thing. You might say, and this is what a kind of sophisticated person in the world would say, well, all you need to do is strike the right balance. If I read one more article about striking the right work-life balance, and you know what? I read them because I'm terrible at it. But I think what Solomon tries to get at is to say this: listen, if what you think is happening here is that your accumulation of stuff and wealth, or your number of hours worked and your balance of it, that really those are the right ingredients and you just need to get them the right way, and then you can eat that satisfaction plate. If you're looking for ultimate meaning there, you won't find it. These are going to be parts of a meaningful world. God has made us for these things. But when we substitute the purpose that God has given us and think that all that needs to happen, we have the right ingredients here under the sun, all we got to do is arrange them the right way, Solomon says, no. You're going to find you will not be satisfied. Get more money, you'll just want more money. Get all the money in the world, and you'll realize still there's a longing in your heart. Eschew wealth, go live in a countryside, don't work at all, and eventually you will eat your own flesh. That is the argument that he's making. All of these things, work, wealth, riches, suffering, injustice, the work of the oppressors, power, wealth. I said wealth. I said it twice. The argument, do you see what's happening here? And there's zigzagging, some in chapter 4, 5, back and forth. It's going to happen through the next number of chapters. What's giving sort of a voice here? What's giving a voice to work, or what's giving a voice to the oppressor? What's giving the voice to injustice? The reason we must address these things, what's giving voice to these, is the longing that humans have for meaning, and we're seeking it in different ways. So, if you want to look generationally, you could even find this, I think. There's certain generations that find meaning in their excellence in professionalism and wealth creation. Then there might be another generation that comes along and says, no, you guys got it all wrong. Don't you realize how empty that is? We've seen the emptiness of this, and it is. So they're right. It's just that they don't find the right solutions. The real thing to do is to relieve suffering in the world, and that's all we need to do. And Solomon's just going to say, all these pursuits, gonzo. Now, I don't want to leave you totally depressed. Remember, we're going to find that the argument of Ecclesiastes does go some directions. But until we wrestle with this thing, we can't get there. We can't shortcut the direction. I just want to say, finally and ultimately, as I'm getting through these things, do not take away from this book the idea then, well, we shouldn't care about suffering and should never work for it. No, that's not the point. Don't come away from this saying, oh, well, I guess then I shouldn't ever try to be skilled or work hard. No, don't say that. Don't come away from this saying, well, I guess then I need to stop being lazy, and if I just worked a little harder, I'll find meaning. That's not the point. There are temporal meanings in these things. They do matter. It's just that they don't matter ultimately. And remember, the loving thing God has done, the good thing God has done in giving us the book, is he knows that he's made us, that we will not be satisfied. We will not find rest. Augustine said, I won't find rest until I find rest in thee. We won't find rest until we have ultimate meaning. And human beings continue to try to be satisfied with temporal and small ones. They do have some value in this life, but not the ultimate one that we're looking for. And that's the argument that he's making all the way through it. We're going to come back next time with a few more big concepts about the use of our words and our vows, as well as themes of fearing God and what does that mean and how do we find joy. Thanks for hanging along. I hope you've watched through as many videos as you can, and we'll be back again next time.